The winter of 1741 fell heavy over New York, not with snow, but with silence. The harbor froze around the ships, trapping men and goods alike. The rich burned imported coal, the poor burned what they could steal, scraps of wood, old barrels, even hope. In the alleys, smoke rose like breath from a dying body. Each morning began the same way, the sound of bells from Trinity Church and the creak of chains from the docks. Slaves hauled barrels of rum through ice that cut their feet open. Above them, merchants shouted about profit, never noticing the blood mixed with frost. At night, the taverns filled with talk of hunger and ghosts. Sailors spoke of fires in the south, of islands where men fought their masters and vanished into the sea. In New York, people laughed at those stories until their own city began to smell like ash. The first fire started in the governor's warehouse, then another 2 streets away, then the barracks. By the 4th blaze, fear burned hotter than wood. Rumors spread faster than flames. The blacks are rising. The slaves want revenge. No one asked who lit the match. They only asked who to hang. Snow turned gray from soot. Children played beside smoldering ruins, making shapes in the ash. One of them drew a ship with no sails. His mother slapped his hand away. "Don't draw the dead," she said. He replied, "It's not dead. It's waiting." The city's papers called it conspiracy. The magistrates called it rebellion. The slaves called it weather. None of them were wrong. The wind carried smoke across the harbor, where it mixed with the fog until you couldn't tell which was sky and which was memory. In the tavern by the pier, a sailor raised his mug and said, "It started with one flame and ended with none." No one understood him. He was talking about the ship that left last spring and never came back, a ship that carried more than rum. The days grew shorter, the nights stayed long, and in every shadow of the city, something waited, not for mercy, but for a name. The city gathered inside the church, not to pray for mercy, but to assign blame. Candles flickered along the stone walls, each one trembling like a confession, afraid to speak. Judge Horsmanden stood before them, his voice echoing against the wooden pews. "There is evil among us." Outside, the snow hissed as it touched the smoldering remains of another fire. Smoke curled up the steeple like an unholy prayer. The congregation bowed their heads, not in faith, but in fear that someone might see their eyes. The governor ordered all slaves in the city to be questioned. The guards moved through streets like shadows with torches. They kicked open cellar doors, demanded names, demanded meaning. The slaves gave them silence. Silence became guilt. At the docks, sailors whispered of curses carried on the wind. They said the fires began after a ship from Jamaica docked, a ship that unloaded rum, sugar, and a dozen new slaves. The name painted on its hull had already faded, the Return. Horsmanden read scripture to justify suspicion. "He that kindles fire shall perish by fire." He underlined the verse 3 times, as though it could turn judgment into proof. In his journal he wrote, "Fear is the only truth left to us." In the tavern behind the market, a group of men argued whether black smoke meant divine punishment or slave sorcery. A beggar muttered, "Fire don't need a color." They threw him out before he could finish. The prisons filled faster than the wagons could carry the accused. Wooden cells overflowed with cold breath and coughing. Guards joked that the fires had moved indoors. The city called it purification. One morning, a blacksmith refused to let his slave work near the forge. "He might teach the fire how to think," he said. The crowd laughed. The slave smiled too, quietly, like someone watching the world explain itself. The sermons on Sunday grew louder. Priests spoke of loyalty, of punishment, of light and darkness. But the people didn't come for scripture. They came for names, names to hang like lanterns above their fear. By the 3rd week, 20 had been arrested. 2 confessed, 3 vanished, and one, a boy no older than 15, said he dreamed of ships burning on the horizon. Horsmanden called it evidence. The fires stopped. The fear did not. Even the snow seemed reluctant to fall, as if the sky itself feared being accused. The city stood in a kind of half-light, too bright for truth, too dark for peace. At the harbor, an old woman sold fish beside the frozen pier. She told anyone who'd listen, "The sea never forgets a lie." Few did. They were too busy counting how many houses still stood. Each night, patrols walked the streets, lanterns swinging, boots scraping frost. From certain alleys, they swore they heard singing. low and foreign, almost kind. The melody ended the same way every time, with the creak of a rope. By now, no one trusted their neighbors. Irish servants accused African dockhands, merchants accused sailors, slaves accused each other to survive. The whole city had become a single whisper, circling itself. In the judge's office, Horsmanden looked over the map of burned buildings. He drew red X's where the flames had started. When he finished, the pattern looked like a cross. He smiled, mistaking coincidence for prophecy. The cold deepened. The harbor froze solid, trapping ships like insects in glass. From one vessel, a sound echoed, a single knock against wood, repeating. No crew aboard, no footprints in the snow. That night, the church bells rang without hands. Some said it was the wind, others said it was a warning. But for those awake to hear it, the sound was neither fire nor faith. It was the sea calling something back. And somewhere in the darkness, Cuffy, the sailor who could read, who could listen, raised his head from his cell and whispered, "The ship hasn't gone, it's waiting." The tavern on Broad Street smelled of rum, fear, and damp wool. Men huddled in corners, pretending to drink but really listening. Because in New York, the most valuable thing in 1741 wasn't gold, it was rumor. Mary Burton stood behind the counter, her hands raw from scrubbing tankards, 16 years old, half-starved, all eyes. She had learned that silence could buy survival, but that night, she spoke. "They're planning to burn the city," she said. Her words slipped through the smoke like a spark in dry straw. The men laughed first, then leaned closer. "Who?" one asked. She pointed toward the docks. "The ones who fetch your barrels, the ones who sleep without shoes." By morning, the governor's men were at the tavern. They took her to the courthouse where Horsmanden sat with ink-stained fingers and sleepless eyes. "Tell me what you heard," he said. She told him everything, and then a little more, because he nodded when she did. The story grew like a flame. Every hour added a new log, a meeting of slaves under the moon, a stolen map of the city, a plan to torch the barracks, the warehouses, the church. The men wrote it all down, grateful for something they could call truth. Mary didn't know what truth was anymore. She only knew that every time she spoke, someone's name was written on the hanging list. The judge called her brave. The tavern called her cursed. In the cell below the courthouse, Cuffy heard her name for the first time. He asked the guard, "The girl who speaks for bread, does she ever eat?" The guard spat. "She's full of God now." The next morning, the city's bells tolled not for worship but for trial. Slaves, laborers, Irish drifters, anyone who fit the shape of guilt, were dragged before the bench. The crowd outside shouted prayers that sounded like sentences. Mary sat on a high stool, feet not touching the floor. Her dress was clean for the first time in months. Horsmanden called her our angel of revelation. She wanted to laugh but didn't. Angels didn't tremble. She pointed to faces in the crowd. Some she knew, most she didn't. Each name became a verdict, each silence a confession. The courtroom smelled of candle smoke and sweat. The sound of scratching quills was louder than the accused. Cuffy stood chained beside two others. When asked if he'd met her before, he said, "Maybe in a dream the city had." The judge frowned. The courtroom murmured. No one wrote down his words. Outside, the tavern that birthed the rumor was closed, its windows boarded. But people still gathered there after dark, whispering through the cracks. "They say she's the devil's mouth. They say she's saving the city. They say the fires will start again." The soldiers drank in silence now. They'd seen too many flames, too many ropes. Some whispered that the fires weren't set by men at all, that the city was burning itself from the inside out, trying to remember what light felt like. Mary dreamed of water every night, black waves rising beneath a red sky. In the dream, a ship drifted toward her without sails. When she woke, she could still taste salt on her lips. The next day, they brought more prisoners. One woman, one boy, two men, all accused by her voice. Horsmanden called them embers of the same fire. Mary looked at their faces and thought they looked more like ashes. She tried to stop once. "Maybe I was mistaken," she told the clerk. He leaned in close and whispered, "If you were wrong, they'll burn you next." She didn't speak again. The city grew quieter as the gallows grew taller. People no longer argued about whether the fires were real. They were too busy watching smoke rise from the square. In his journal, Horsmanden wrote, "Fear spreads best through faith." He underlined it twice. Mary's name began to fade from the gossip, replaced by the men she accused. Yet, sometimes in the tavern ruins, sailors swore they heard her voice behind the walls, whispering, "The ship is waiting." And in his cell, Cuffy smiled through a broken lip. "Then maybe," he said, "it's waiting for us." The courtroom smelled of tallow and wet wool. Outside, the snow had turned black from the smoke of burned houses and bodies. Inside, men in wigs argued over words that no longer meant anything: rebellion, treason, salvation. The crowd came not to listen, but to see someone fall. The prisoners were lined in chains, their faces half lit by candlelight. Some prayed, some stared back. Cuffy did neither. He stood still, his eyes fixed on the open window, the only thing in the room that didn't lie. Judge Horsmanden cleared his throat. "This city has suffered fire upon fire," he began, "and where there is smoke, there must be sinners." The crowd nodded. Fear makes fine agreement. The first to speak was an Irish laborer named John. He had been accused of teaching slaves how to use gunpowder. "I can't even spell gunpowder," he said. The court laughed, then ordered his execution. Next was Sarah, a washerwoman who had been seen near the governor's house the night of the first fire. "I was looking for my boy," she said. "The soldiers took him." Horsmanden called her voice too clever for a servant. The sentence came before the echo of her words had faded. Cuffy was last. The clerk asked his name. "You know it," he said. "You wrote it down before I spoke." The crowd murmured. Horsmanden slammed his gavel. "You are charged with conspiracy, with plotting rebellion against His Majesty's peace." Cuffy smiled. "Whose peace?" The judge hesitated. The gallery fell silent. Outside, a gull cried over the frozen harbor. Somewhere beyond the wall, wood creaked. A ship or a gallows, no one could tell. Mary Burton sat near the front, her hands trembling around a Bible too heavy for her. She hadn't slept in days. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw fire reflected in water. Horsmanden noticed her and softened his tone. "You have guided us, child," he said. "Your testimony has saved the city." She didn't answer. The Bible in her lap felt warm, as if someone else were holding it. Cuffy turned to her, chains clinking like small bells. "Do you remember the sea?" he asked quietly. "It remembers you." The guard struck him for speaking out of turn. Blood touched his lip. He didn't wipe it away. The courtroom watched, some with disgust, others with envy. There's a strange kind of freedom in having nothing left to lose. When the verdict came, it was already written. Guilty, guilty, guilty. The gavel fell like thunder against a coffin lid. Outside, the gallows waited. Ropes swung gently in the wind, creaking like the timbers of a ship. The crowd followed the condemned through the snow, torches hissing, boots cracking the ice. It wasn't justice they wanted. It was warmth. At the foot of the scaffold, Cuffy raised his head toward the harbor. The fog was thick, but he could still see the masts, still, silent, like crosses waiting for wind. "The ship that never returned," he whispered. "It sails tonight." The hangman pulled the hood over his face. Horsmanden stood at a distance, notebook open, recording the last words of a man he would later call lucid in madness. When the trapdoor fell, the crowd exhaled. The wind changed, and somewhere out on the frozen harbor, wood groaned as if something enormous had shifted beneath the ice. That night, the fire stopped for good. But the city did not sleep. People heard creaking in their roofs, footsteps above their heads, whispers from the chimneys. The governor said it was wind. Horsmanden said it was guilt. Mary said nothing at all. In the morning, they found her gone. The Bible lay open on the bench, a single word burned into the page by candle flame. Return. The ice on the harbor had cracked overnight. A single set of footprints led from the shore to the open water and ended there. By noon, the sea had swallowed the trail. And in the distance, through the gray mist, sailors swore they saw a ship with black sails drifting toward the horizon. No crew, no flag, no sound, only smoke. The papers called it hysteria. Horsmanden wrote it down as evidence of divine retribution. But among the slaves in the docks, they whispered a different story, that the ship carried the souls of those who refused to kneel. They called it the return, and every winter after, when the harbor froze again, the wind carried the same sound through the city, the groan of wood, the whisper of chains, and a faint voice saying, "Not gone, waiting." The harbor never froze the same way again. Each winter the water turned darker, as though ink had leaked from the city's sins. Fishermen said the ice sang at night, a low hum, deep as breath, rising and falling with the tide. The soldiers called it superstition. The slaves called it memory. A year had passed since the hangings, but New York still smelled of smoke. The gallows were gone, yet the square remained empty, as if the ground itself refused to forget what it had held. Horsmanden wrote in his journal, "The city is healed." But his hand trembled over every word. He dreamed often of the ship. In his dreams it waited under the harbor, its masts tangled with ice, its deck lit by blue fire. Each time a woman stood on the bow, Mary Burton, face pale as the moon, eyes fixed on him. "You wrote our names wrong," she said. "The sea is correcting you." When he woke, his bedsheets were damp with salt. The servants whispered that he smelled like the docks. He forbade them to speak of it again. At the water's edge, a sailor found something frozen in the ice, a piece of wood with letters carved in it. Most were unreadable, but one stood clear. Return. He sold it for a pint of rum. The tavern keeper hung it over the door, and for months after, no one dared drink beneath it. The city carried on. New ships came, old ships left, and business returned. But the dockworkers noticed strange things: barrels that creaked through sealed, ropes that frayed overnight, water that never stayed still even when frozen. One man swore he saw bubbles rise beneath the ice in the shape of hands. When the governor ordered a new ship built to replace the one that had never returned, the carpenters refused to start work before sunrise. "Something walks under the planks," they said. The overseer laughed, but his laughter stopped when one of the beams split open to reveal a rusted chain inside, still wet though the timber was dry. Horsmanden tried to write a sermon about repentance. He wanted to believe justice had been done, but every time he dipped his quill in ink, the words smeared, as if the paper rejected them. He began to dream while awake, seeing fire through water, hearing voices beneath silence. One night, a thick fog rolled in from the Atlantic. It was heavier than mist, clinging to the docks like cloth. The harbor bells rang once, then stopped. By morning, 3 ships had snapped their moorings and drifted out to sea, their sails untouched by wind. The city awoke to silence. Even the gulls were gone. Horsmanden went to the window and saw the ice glowing faintly red beneath the fog. He fell to his knees, whispering prayers no one had written yet. Down by the pier, an old enslaved stevedore named Samuel stood staring at the water. When asked what he saw, he said, "Not ships, shadows of ships, the ones that carried us here." He lifted his hand as though to wave. The fog lifted with him. From the water rose a hull, black, smooth, and impossibly still. No sound of oars, no creak of timber, no cry of crew, just the faint reflection of the city burning again in its surface. Then, just as suddenly, it sank, leaving only ripples that froze mid-motion. That night, the church bell tower collapsed without warning. Some said the foundation had rotted. Others said it bowed to something older than God. Horsmanden watched the dust settle and whispered, "It has returned." The city began to lose its voice. Merchants found their ledgers blank in the morning. Soldiers forgot commands. Even the judges' decrees came out twisted, words repeating themselves: fire, fire, fire. The townsfolk blamed the cold. The slaves smiled and said, "No, the ice is remembering." When spring came, the harbor thawed, except for one place near the old gallows where the water stayed hard as stone. Beneath it, something dark moved slowly, the shape of a ship turning in silence. Children threw stones at it, laughing. One stone cracked the ice and a bubble of air rose, carrying a whisper so faint it barely disturbed the surface. The boy who'd thrown it swore he heard a woman's voice say, "Keep counting." Horsmanden fell ill soon after. Fever took his sight first, then his sleep. On his last night, he asked his servant to open the window. The harbor wind blew in, heavy with salt. "Do you hear it?" he asked. The servant said no. Horsmanden smiled. "Then you're safe." At dawn, the servant found the judge's chair empty. Footprints led to the shore. The tide was low. The ice had broken. Out on the water, the fog hung like breath over glass. Somewhere beneath it, a sound echoed, the creak of ropes, the flap of sails, the faint rhythm of chains. The ship that never returned had come home, but not for revenge, for witness. Because every empire that builds its wealth on bones must one day hear the bones speak. And that morning, New York listened, whether it wanted to or not. The sea never speaks twice. It says what it must, then waits. But that spring of 1742, the harbor whispered every night. The sound came from beneath the waves, a slow rhythm, like oars cutting through water that no one rowed. The sailors stopped drinking near the docks. They said the rum turned bitter if poured after midnight. The fishmongers stopped working before dawn. Their nets came up full of ash instead of scales. And the church, rebuilt in haste, stood empty, its bell gone, its echoes stolen by fog. Mary Burton was said to be dead, but stories travel better than bodies. Some swore they saw her walking along the pier at dusk, her dress wet, her hair slicked with salt. Others said she never left the water at all, that she walked beneath it, her feet never touching the sand. The slaves called her the voice of the return. The merchants called her curse. The governor called her lie. But every man who heard the harbor at night felt the same weight, the sound of chains rustling, not from fear but from motion. When the first body floated in, a sailor with eyes wide open, skin pale as wax, the city buried him without name. The next night, there were two more. Their mouths were full of coal dust. "The sea's burning," a boy whispered. His mother told him not to say such things aloud. The docks emptied, but no one left the city. They couldn't. The ships that tried to sail east turned back in circles. Captains swore they saw the same landmarks again and again, the same gull, the same wave, the same horizon that refused to move. In the courthouse, Horsmanden's replacement read through the old judge's notes. The pages were damp, the ink blurred by salt. Between the words, faint lines of another hand appeared, written in soot. "The fire still walks." By midsummer, the fog thickened. Even the sun seemed reluctant to enter. The governor ordered cannon fire to clear the mist, iron against air, but the smoke only grew denser, rolling back over the city like a tide. At the edge of the harbor, Samuel the stevedore stood alone, watching. "It's not coming for us," he said. "It's coming for the truth." His words frightened no one, not because they were strange, but because they made too much sense. That night, the last church candle burned itself out. The city went dark, save for the glow under the water. From the governor's window, it looked like lanterns drifting beneath the surface, hundreds of them moving in rows. He thought it was reflection. Then, he saw faces. Men, women, children, all walking across the seabed, their chains trailing behind like ribbons. Their eyes were open, calm, unafraid. The governor screamed for the guards, but his voice drowned in the hum, that low, steady rhythm that sounded like rowing or breathing or both. By morning, the glow was gone. Only the tide remained, carrying bits of wood and rope, fragments of ships long buried. The city tried to return to normal, but every time a door closed, every time a hammer struck wood, the sound echoed 3 times. Knock, 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 the heartbeat of the sea. In the years that followed, the story changed. The fires became rebellion, the rebellion became rumor, and the rumor became history. The ship was forgotten. The sea was not. New York grew, layer upon layer, its harbor dredged, its bones buried. But on winter nights, when the fog rolled in from the Atlantic, people still woke to the sound of chains in the water. Sailors said it was the tide rubbing against the hulls. The old ones said, no, it's the sea remembering who it carried. Centuries passed. The gallows square became a market, the tavern a warehouse, the courthouse a museum. And one day, a diver dredging the harbor floor found something smooth beneath the mud, blackened wood, curved like a spine. They pulled it up in pieces. It was a ship, they said, though no one could find its name. The wood was burned but whole, the nails rusted yet strong. When the last beam surfaced, it split open, releasing a breath of warm air that smelled of salt and smoke. The scientists called it trapped gas. The dockworkers called it truth escaping. They put the fragments on display. Glass cases, neat labels, silence. Tourists stared, took photographs, moved on. But the security guard swore that sometimes, after midnight, he heard footsteps around the exhibit. Wet ones. One night, he followed the sound to the window overlooking the harbor. The fog had returned. In its reflection, he saw not himself, but a figure standing beside him. A young woman with salt in her hair, eyes bright, holding a single candle. He blinked. She was gone, but the candle's flame remained in the glass, flickering where there was no fire. 3 slow beats, then stillness. The next morning, the guard quit. He told no one why, but before leaving he wrote on the exhibit's logbook in a shaky hand, "The ship has returned." Now, when the winter winds rise, the harbor lights flicker 3 times before steadying. Engineers call it electrical interference. The old fishermen just nod. "She's passing through," they say. And if you walk by the pier on those nights, you might hear it, faint beneath the hum of the city, the rhythm of oars that aren't there, the creak of a mast that never stops, the whisper of a name long buried beneath empire and ice. The return. And in the water's reflection, if you look long enough, you might see the truth New York still tries to forget, that the sea does not forgive, but it never forgets. Because the sea remembers everything we tried to drown. And sometimes, when the tide is right, it brings it all back. Some say history sinks, but nothing that screams ever really drowns. New York was built on trade, on faith, on fear, and on men who never came home. Their names were erased, but the water kept them. Every tide, every whisper of fog is their signature. The judges are gone, the gallows are gone, but the harbor still breathes. Listen long enough, and you'll hear it, 3 knocks deep below the pier. It isn't the sea asking for forgiveness. It's the sea remembering who forgot. This was the ship that never returned. And this is Slavery's Dark Past. Subscribe, remember, and let the water speak again.